My name is Simon Mills. I'm a Senior Associate at Zien, and I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of the 16th edition of the Global Green Finance Index. I'm going to be your chairman this morning, so let me lay out the agenda. In just a moment, our CEO, Mike Wardle, is going to be taking you through the runners and riders for this edition of the GGFI. You'll then be briefly hearing from me again on the topic of transition finance before Mike rounds off the presentation with some conclusions. We're then going to have a Q&A session before we close. Now, I'm afraid that you're all muted, but please do leave your questions using the chat tool at any point of the proceedings. I'm going to collate them as we go along, and we will do our best to answer them at the end. We're going to be recording this presentation, and it will be available to stream on our website and our YouTube channel and LinkedIn channels within the next 24 hours. A full copy of GGFI 16 is going to be available to download from our website, longfinance.net, immediately after this webinar ends. Now, we have got a great deal to get through, so without further ado, I will hand you over to Mike.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and greetings all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are across the world. Just a few words about the GGFI. First of all, we launched the index in 2018, and in the first edition of the index, we included 47 international financial centres. This edition includes 94 centres, showing, I think, the development of green finance in different parts of the world, and I'll speak a bit more about that development a little bit later. The GGFI is a factor assessment index. That means it's based on two different data sets. The first is a survey questionnaire that we run continuously that invites financial professionals to rate financial centres for the depth and the quality of their green finance. And then the other set of factors, a set of quantitative data, and these are drawn from a whole range of different sources, including the obvious of the World Bank and OECD, but also a lot of commercial data providers. And we combine those two sets of data using a machine learning algorithm that looks at the correlation between the assessments and the data. And in effect, what we're doing is crowdsourcing the wisdom of finance professionals across the world to put a weight onto the quantitative data factors. In terms of who gets involved in the GGFI, these two charts show respondents by sector, showing we have a good range of responses from people working in all sectors of finance. And then by region, Asia Pacific and Western Europe are the main places who get engaged, but also over 20% of responses are people from the Middle East and Africa. So a truly global effort in terms of responding to the survey. Looking at the centres in the index, this map shows all 94 centres in the index, and you'll see there are clusters. Western Europe has a cluster, North America has a cluster, Asia Pacific has a cluster, and the Middle East has a cluster as well. There's fewer centres listed in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we are glad that we are seeing more centres join the index in Africa. So again, a good spread, but noting that clustering of major centres in particular parts of the world. So the headlines. First of all, we've had a change at the top of the index. Zurich has just overtaken London to take first place in the index. Singapore and Geneva retain third and fourth positions. Amsterdam, Paris and Brussels enter the top 10, replacing Montreal, Oslo and Toronto. And it's really notable that Western European centres take 9 of the top 10 places, with Singapore the only outlier from Asia Pacific. And shows, I think, the continued dominance of Western Europe in terms of thinking about and commitment to green finance. Among the top 10 centres, the spread of ratings is quite close, but it's widened a little since the last edition of the index. And there's reasonable stability in the rankings. 13 centres out of the 94 rose 10 or more places, 7 fell 10 or more places. A big thing, though, is a continuing drop in confidence in the development of green finance, which we measure through the average rating given to centres. In the last edition of the index, the average rating was down almost 6%. In this edition, the average rating is down another 3%. So a drop of 8.8% over the last 12 months. And quality ratings fell 6.6%, while depth ratings fell 11%. And this really reflects, I think, concerns about the amount of green finance being transacted across the world. And we'll come on maybe to some of the factors that are driving that change as we go forward. Looking at the top 20 centres, I've mentioned many of them as we've gone through that first list, noting that Amsterdam and Frankfurt have both gone up 10 or more places. Munich there is up 9 places, while other centres have fallen back a bit. But the main headline here, I think, is that Western Europe really does dominate at the top of the index. As I mentioned, we score both depth and quality of green finance when we're looking at the ratings in the index. And we do see some differences here. So, for example, in the quality measure, the first, second, and third places are identical to those in the overall index. However, in the depth measure, Copenhagen actually comes first, and then Zurich, London, Geneva, and Amsterdam are tied in second place on the depth measure. And so when you're looking at your development as a financial centre, just having an idea of the balance between how people assess your quality and how people think of the depth of green finance in your centre is an important consideration. And we can track that relationship between depth and quality to see that some centres have greater strength in quality, some in depth. So someone like Paris, for example, or Lugano, very much are seen as having higher quality of green finance, but not so much in terms of the depth. Whereas Copenhagen, Amsterdam, very much high on the depth front, but their quality may be scored slightly lower. One of the things we do in the GGFI is then produce sub-indices which score by instrumental factor group. So we take the quantitative data and arrange it in 4 different areas: sustainability, business, human capital, and infrastructure. And you'll see that the top 3 centres in the overall index share the top 3 places on each of those areas of competitiveness. And really, to be a leading centre in the GGFI, you need to be strong across all areas of the data. But we do see some interesting strengths coming in. Brussels, for example, up there at 6 for business. We see Frankfurt very high for infrastructure. And again, when you're thinking about financial centre development, it's useful to think about where your strengths and weaknesses may lie, and therefore where you need to put effort into development in your particular centre. It's also a pointer as to where people might want to invest and what matters to them in terms of their investment in particular places in the world. The other set of sub-indices we produce cut the data differently. We take just the survey responses from people working in particular sectors and run the model once again. Here we see some quite interesting changes. Frankfurt does very well from people working in policy. Singapore does very well from people working in capital markets. Stockholm does very well from people working in professional services. So again, this is a kind of measure of the reputation that individual centres have based on people working in different sectors of the business. Someone like Paris, does well in knowledge. Someone like Frankfurt does less well when the capital markets and professional services people are involved, than they do in the general index. Another analysis we do, however, is to take the GGFI and only use the responses of people who directly work in green finance. On this measure, we see that Zurich still comes at the top of the list, but Geneva would come second, London third, Oslo would shift up to fourth place in the index, Edinburgh would move up to eighth. So people working in green finance have a different view as to the strengths of different centres, and we track that as well through the index. Moving on to the regional performance. As I mentioned, Western Europe, European centres doing very well. The top 15 centres in Western Europe are all in the top 20 globally. I mentioned earlier Amsterdam and Frankfurt have done very well. And just to note that Oslo has dropped back a bit in this edition of the index. And really the dominance of Western Europe, I think, comes from the continued policy interest from governments and in the jurisdictions, and the shared understanding that sustainability and climate change are worth additional effort when you're looking at policy and how we respond to policy. Turning to the Middle East and Africa, Dubai continues to lead the region, Tel Aviv in second place, followed by Abu Dhabi. Casablanca leads in Africa. And just to note that Doha, Kigali and Riyadh have all had really good results in this edition. Doha and Kigali up 10 ranking places, Riyadh up 15 ranking places. So something's going on in those centres that we may need to pay attention to. And it shows there is movement in the index, and you can shift the balance. Looking at Asia Pacific, I mentioned earlier that Singapore is the only centre in the top 20 in Asia Pacific. Busan and Seoul come next, and Korea is doing a great deal on green finance, and that is recognised. Followed by Shenzhen, Beijing, Shanghai, the group of leading Chinese centres. So we do see, I think, Asia Pacific coming from behind, and one of the interesting geopolitical shifts we're seeing is perhaps a need for leadership in green finance at the moment coming from Western Europe, but an opportunity, I think, for Asia Pacific centres to take perhaps a lead. Looking at North America, almost all centres in North America are down in the rankings. And you'll see that the first three on this list are Canadian centres, not US centres. Even a couple of editions of the GGFI ago, that would have been a different picture. And New York would have been up right in the top 10. And I think it shows how green finance generally is affected and driven, in a sense, by the policy environment. So it's, I think, not unexpected that the one centre who's really done well in North America in this edition of the index is San Francisco. California perhaps has a different view about green finance and sustainability than is driven by national politics at present in the US. And that position, I think, will remain, and US centres will have difficulty in performing well in the GGFI given the current policy climate. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Kaunas continues to lead in the region, with Prague still in second place. And just to note, Almaty has moved up 20 ranking places, so a very good performance there. But generally, centres here are up in the rankings, and Eastern Europe and Central Asian centres seem to be doing well at present. On Latin America and the Caribbean, then there's a mix of results in terms of ranking performance. Sao Paulo continues to lead in the centre, Santiago in second place. But generally, centres in this region are towards the middle and lower end of the index results. And I mentioned earlier there's fewer centres in Latin America and the Caribbean participating and entering the index. I'm going to pause there and hand back to Simon for some of his observations on the GGFI in this edition. Simon, we can't hear you at the moment.
To apologise, I'd muted myself. As you know, for each edition of the GGFI, we include a supplement focusing on a specific aspect of green finance. And for GGFI 16, we've been very fortunate to have the supplement provided by GF60, an international think tank for green finance, which is headquartered in Shanghai. And the focus of their research is transition finance. Could we have the next slide, please? So what is transition finance? Well, the concept was first crystallized in the G20 in 2019. And whilst definitions vary amongst institutions, a consensus has been reached on its key characteristic, which is providing supports to high carbon, hard to abate sectors in the transition to net zero. Traditional green finance primarily supports pure green industries and technologies such as renewables, but the big brown industries, and we're talking about cement and steel and agriculture and marine and air transport, and of course existing power generation infrastructure, urgently need funding for technological upgrades and emission reductions. With respect to transition finance, there are two ways to do this. There's taxonomy based and principles based. A taxonomy based approach is exemplified by frameworks and provides explicit lists of eligible transition activities within specific sectors. And this is the method which has been adopted by both the People's Bank of China and the European Union. A principles-based approach, on the other hand, develops Paris Agreement-aligned transition plans, which are subject to third-party verification. And this is the method which has been favoured by Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. But regardless of the approach used, it's important to stress that transition finance is not an alternative to green finance. The two are entirely complementary and both are critical to the achievement of net zero goals. So what do transition products look like? Well, the landscape is currently dominated by debt instruments, transition-related loans and transition-related bonds, and there is a strong crossover, obviously, with green bonds respect to the last of these. However, there are also some developments within the equity and insurance sectors as well. But of course, there are significant obstacles to overcome if transition finance is to thrive. Firstly, the criteria for defining transition activities aren't yet unified, and the absence of a single classification does actually complicate cross-border project certification and increases the risk of transition washing, for want of a better word. For example, Japan's transition finance taxonomy still includes coal under certain conditions, whereas the EU taxonomy has strictly excluded it. And the second thing is that the quality information disclosure is uneven. When you're lacking a consistent framework and third-party verification mechanisms, this is a particular stumbling block, particularly for developing economies. But you know, the immaturity of the carbon accounting procedures in general and weak data remain an issue for everyone. But I think that perhaps the biggest issue that we've got at the moment is that transition finance instruments generally don't offer a clear green premium. And you know, they also carry elevated technology and policy risks, which does deter private capital. So transition finance is really reliant on an effective and stable policy environment. But the sector is gathering momentum, and it's likely to be a major focus at the next COP. And if we do get standardization and coordination and mutual recognition of processes, this is going to accelerate, and frameworks are going to follow. So the market for these products is actually currently growing rapidly, and you'll note that the supplement details the enormous growth of this sector within China. And I think this raises an absolutely fascinating point. Facing a shortfall in climate finance commitments from developed countries and a complete abrogation of responsibility by the United States, Asian financial centers are actively shifting their role from passive recipients of international rules to proactive builders of a transition finance ecosystem which is adapted to regional characteristics. And financial centers such as Shanghai are deepening the South-South cooperation network, mobilizing their own resources and providing practical and effective support for the green and low carbon transition of other developing countries. So watch this space. Mike.
Thank you very much, Simon. I kind of guess in conclusions, one of the things I wanted to look at was the relationship between two of the entities we produce, the Global Financial Centers Index, which looks at general finance, and the Global Green Finance Index. And we see that when we compare the two, there are a few centers that score well, both in the GFCI and the GGFI. Places like London and Singapore, Geneva and Zurich are up there in the top 20 in both of these indexes. But there are really big differences. So somewhere like New York is quite a bit lower in the GGFI than it is in the Global Financial Centers Index, where it takes first position. So there's something here about being good at general finance, not always translating into being good in the green finance area. And also something around, I think, some niche performers. So we have some centers that do extraordinarily well in green finance because they have focused on green finance and really developed a niche strength in that bit of finance. And finally, we've done some work obviously on what is driving green finance. And according to respondents to our surveys, it's policy and regulatory frameworks, climate change and public awareness. And again, that underlines in green finance the importance of regulatory frameworks on the demand side in driving green finance. Leadership in green finance continues to come from Europe, as we've mentioned, but increasingly the challenger is in Asia rather than the US, and there's real opportunities there, I think, for Asia-Pacific centers to take the lead. Geopolitical and economic shifts challenge the sector. It is a public policy-driven sector, and if there's a lack of strong policy, it does affect the development of green finance and the delivery of green finance. And just to say that centers which perform well in the GGFI generally are committed to environmental improvements across the economy. It's not just finance. They are thinking about sustainability in the round and have a real depth in sustainability skills. And that seems to be the thing which differentiates centers which are doing well in the GGFI. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think, Simon, we now move to Q&A.
Thanks, Mike. Now, we've come to the end of our presentation. It's time to pick up on the questions that you've put to us. So let me just have a look here. This is an interesting question. Over the 8 years since the inception of the GGFI, to what extent do you detect centres are collaborative, and where and to what extent are they highly competitive? So I think this is basically asking us if there is a tension between collaboration or cooperation, and what we've observed within this space. Mike, do you want to start this one?
Sure, it's a really interesting question, because the financial centres actually do understand that they have a lot to learn from each other, particularly in emerging instruments such as green finance. So, for example, the UN Financial Centres for Sustainability Group now I think has around 30 financial centres, and they collaborate. They meet to collaborate and find out what each is doing. I talk to a lot of financial centres across the world, and many of them are really interested in collaboration. Many have memoranda of understanding between each other, and they share both what they are facing in terms of challenge, but also some of the solutions that they are coming up with. However, on top of that, they of course do compete with each other for business. And if you talk to people from Hong Kong and Singapore, if you talk to people who are geographically potentially close, then they are going to be in competition. And I think the word for this is co-opetition. It's some form, somewhere between collaboration and competition, where people share knowledge and ideas, but then go away and try to be much better at delivering those ideas than their neighbouring centre or the one in which they feel they're competing. That said, of course, there are many interesting flows of green finance, and one of the things that somewhere like Luxembourg has done very successfully is to be a centre where they issue bonds from other parts of the world, and that they're issued in Luxembourg, and that seems to suit people very well. So there's a real mix, I think, but financial centres certainly collaborate. They do understand the need to learn from each other, but they compete on the particular strengths that they see and with each other.
Absolutely. I do think it's important to remember that trade is not a zero-sum game. Each party has to gain something from it, and one of the advantages of cooperation, particularly on standards, is that you're enlarging the size of the pie. You're actually making the market larger, so everybody stands to benefit. Now let's have a look. We have another question here. Right, this one is asking us about individual centres, business environment and policy changes, and how greatly that impacts the ratings and rankings. I think this is probably alluding to how things are changing within the US.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things here. I think, first of all, one of the reasons we combine quantitative data with a survey is that financial centre reputation actually is important, and how people are perceived in terms of financial centre is one of the things which influences the way the business happens. And I think it is the fact that people in our survey are influenced by changes in what they see of a city's business environment and how it's responding to policy. And our methodology is very neutral on this. In other words, we don't weight any of the factors. We don't get in the way. We just simply run the data model to look at the correlations between assessments and the quantitative data. But it's certainly, I think, true that where people perceive a financial centre or a jurisdiction to have a strong commitment to green finance or to sustainability development more generally, then that does reflect in the way that people rate each of the centres. And I thought it was very interesting in this edition of the index that the ratings for depth definitely could demonstrably dropped further than the ratings for quality. In other words, people, I think, are still seeing good quality work going on, but the real message from people's assessments this time is that the amount of green finance which is being undertaken is perhaps weaker in many centres than it has been before.
Okay, well, this that leads on quite nicely to this question, which is about measuring the geographical flows of green investment. Do we know, for example, where the investment flows into Canada or Europe or the US, where they actually come from?
I don't have that data to hand. It's an interesting research project, which I will give some thoughts to. What I do have some information on is how people perceive whether their financial centres are focused on international or domestic finance. And what we find is that the two regions of the world where people generally say that they are more focused on international finance are in Western Europe and in the Middle East and Africa. And I think that says something about the openness of centres in those two regions to be looking at international investment flows. And certainly we have seen a lot of both inward and outbound investment from the Gulf and the Middle East, and Western Europe is the beneficiary of being seen to be very good at green finance in terms of allowing investment flows into in and out of the rest of the world. So I don't have direct information on where the
don't forget, Mike, that we do have the connectivity tool on our website, which actually allows you to see how different centres are connected and the strength of those connections. It doesn't actually measure investment flows, but it does give you an indication of how closely aligned in business terms different centres are. So I'd urge you to have a look at that particular tool.
And just to say that not specifically on green finance, but looking at investment flows generally, we have seen a sort of broadening of the investment flows within Asia. So Japanese and Korean investors who might have particularly invested in China a decade ago are now investing in other parts of Asia, both Central Asia and Southeast Asia. So we do see more investment going into places like Malaysia and Vietnam and Laos and Uzbekistan compared with maybe a decade ago. I don't have data on whether that's green finance flows, and something I'll give some thought to.
Right, we have a very interesting question here, which says, Simon, Mike, interesting to see the gap between the overall rankings and how those change when those involved in green finance are asked. As a Scottish Government representative, it's especially interesting to see Edinburgh's ranking change as a result of this. What are the sector experts within green finance looking for in their rankings as opposed to the general ones? And what more could Edinburgh do?
I think the difference is that people working in green finance perhaps have a more realistic view of what is happening in centres, to put it kindly. They're more close to the action. They're probably following more of the data points. And that's one of the reasons we do this analysis, because we think people working in green finance might have a particular insight into what's happening in financial centres. It doesn't mean we should only pay attention to the views of those working in green finance, because others will have a view, and it's important to take those into account. So for someone like Edinburgh, where people in green finance are rating you higher than the general finance population, it suggests to me that there's something to do with telling people about how great Edinburgh is doing on green finance. In other words, those in the know what's happening. Those not in the know need to be told. And that's a continuing marketing issue for all financial centres to make sure that people understand what's really going on in their centre. So I think for this one, it's not doing more by Edinburgh. It's actually shouting a bit louder about Edinburgh's success in green finance. Obviously, those working in green finance recognise Edinburgh's strength, and places like Amsterdam, those working in general finance perhaps haven't yet seen the evidence, and they need to be told.
Absolutely, and commissioning research is an excellent way of doing that, wouldn't you agree, Mike?
He would say that, wouldn't he? Yes, exactly.
Right, now this is an interesting and quite pointed question. Why is Taipei not in the GGFI list? What are Taipei's weaknesses?
Yeah, this is not really about anybody's weaknesses or strengths. The way in which we bring people into the index is that we look at the number of people across the world who have rated that particular financial center, and you have to get to a minimum level over a 24-month period to be brought into the GGFI. So it's not to do with any weakness of Taipei, just at the moment not enough people from other parts of the world have rated Taipei as a financial center to give us the data points we need to run the model and bring an understanding of Taipei's performance. So there are things that can be done about that. I know that the Stock Exchange and the Academy of Banking and Finance in Taiwan are very active, and if Taipei wish to come into the GGFI, it's a matter of spreading the news in terms of the GGFI survey and getting people to include Taipei in their rating.
Now, this is an interesting question. Japan is the global leader for TNFD downloads. How has its ranking changed in recent years? Now, TNFD is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So I suspect that what this questioner would like to know is, has there been any significant movement in Tokyo's ranking over the last few years reflecting this particular interest in nature and nature financial disclosure?
Yeah, and the short answer is not really. Both Tokyo and Osaka feature in the GGFI, and they've been broadly stable over the last few editions. There hasn't been any great shifts in their ranking. But interestingly, the other thing that is happening here is that when we ask people in the survey about what are the most important and the most interesting and the most impactful areas of green finance, nature measures really come quite low down the list. At the moment, people don't seem to be persuaded of the importance of protecting diversity and nature in the global setting, at least, as much as they are about climate change in particular. So there's something here, I think, both about generally people don't give so much importance to that area. And also Japan is doing is doing reasonably well in the GGFI, but we haven't seen a particular uptick.
I think there is time for one final question, and this is about fluctuations in respondents' ratings for each city. Now, the questioner believes that the rating is influenced by changes in the city's business environment and national policy changes, as well as changes in the respondents' areas of interest. How much influence do we think each of these factors has?
Sure. I think it's difficult to get behind the mind of somebody who's filling in a survey and work out what it is that's influencing their judgment. But we ask people first of all to identify places they know something about in terms of answering the questions. And so people who are filling in our surveys are looking at what they know about what's happening in the center which they're rating. Business environment certainly affected. Human capital was certainly affected. Sustainability generally was certainly affected, as well infrastructure. So it's in the round, how do you rate what's happening in this place? But more distinctly, it's what's happening in green finance in that center. So the general business environment may be of a particular type. But is it a good place for doing green finance? Is it welcoming for people who are doing green finance? Is the regulatory system one which supports green finance? Is a really interesting question for those who are looking at green finance in that city. In terms of environmental and sustainability, how real does the commitment feel from the city management or the country management in terms of green finance and sustainability, and how is that supporting the development of green finance in the center? On human capital, do I see that people are being encouraged to train and to develop qualifications in green finance. And so it's all those things that people, if you know a centre, you'll have a view about whether the business environment in the round is conducive to green finance or not. And that seems to be what influences how people rate individual centres.
Excellent. Now, I'm afraid we have run out of time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your participation in this webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning, GGFI 16 is available to download free of charge from our website. That's longfinance.net. We will also be able to access a recording of this webinar shortly. I'd also urge you to keep an eye on our forthcoming events page for more webinars, which include The Big Problem, Why Most Music Never Leaves the Bedroom, which is taking place on the 13th of November, How Quantum is Set to Revolutionize Investing, which is taking place on the 18th of November, and Towards a Global Financial Hub, Busan International Financial Center, which you can join on the 25th of November. You can catch up with all our previous webinars on YouTube, on LinkedIn, and of course on our website. It just remains for me to thank Mike for his presentation, and of course to thank you all for attending, and to wish you a very productive day. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.